The photograph sat face down in Everett Caldwell's desk drawer for 40 years. He never looked at it anymore. Didn't need to. Every detail was burned into his memory. Yokohama Harbor, 1945. Harumi standing beside him in a borrowed dress, holding a single chrysanthemum, her eyes uncertain. His hand on her shoulder, protective, possessive. That photo represented the greatest lie of his life, and the greatest love. And in September 1985, a letter postmarked from Hiroshima would prove that some secrets refuse to die with the people who bury them. August 1945. Japan had surrendered 6 days ago. The war was over, but Yokohama looked like the war had won. Everett Caldwell walked through streets that barely existed anymore. Sergeant stripes on his sleeve, dust on his boots. The occupation had just begun, and already he could feel the weight of it. Victory didn't feel the way they'd told him it would. It felt like ash and silence and people who wouldn't meet your eyes. He'd been assigned to a logistics unit, coordinating supply distribution to displaced civilians. Boring work, safe work, the kind of assignment that made him feel guilty when he thought about the guys who never made it past Iwo Jima. That's when he first saw her. September morning, outside a makeshift clinic the Army had set up in what used to be a school. She was carrying a crate of medical supplies too heavy for her frame, but she wouldn't let anyone help. Everett watched her struggle up the steps, jaw set, determined. Something about that stubbornness caught him. He approached, offered to take the crate. She looked at him like he'd offered to take her dignity. Then she stumbled. He caught the crate. She caught her breath. And for just a moment, their eyes met with something that wasn't quite hostility, and wasn't quite gratitude. Something in between. Something that felt like recognition. Her name was Harumi Fujiwara. She worked as a translator and assistant at the clinic, helping American medics communicate with Japanese patients. Her English was remarkably good, precise, almost textbook. She told him she'd learned it in school before the war. Everett didn't think much of it then. Lots of educated Japanese spoke some English. What struck him was how she carried herself, upright, controlled, like she was holding herself together by sheer will. He started finding reasons to visit the clinic, delivering supplies, checking inventory, making sure everything was properly documented. All legitimate excuses, all pretense. They talked in fragments at first, small exchanges, the weather, the work, careful words in the space between two countries that had just tried to kill each other. But slowly, carefully, something grew. Harumi had lost her family in the firebombing of Tokyo. Parents, 2 younger brothers. She'd survived because she'd been sent to Yokohama for work before the raids intensified. She didn't say what kind of work. Everett didn't push. Everyone had ghosts they didn't want to name. He told her about Ohio, about his father's hardware store, about his sister Doris who wrote him letters filled with gossip about people he barely remembered, about how strange it felt to be standing in Japan, occupying the country he'd been trained to destroy, wondering what any of it had been for. October became November. The occupation settled into routine, and Everett Caldwell realized he was falling in love with a woman whose country he'd helped defeat. It should have felt wrong. Maybe it was wrong. But when Harumi smiled, really smiled, not the polite mask she wore for the Americans, but something genuine and unguarded, Everett felt like he'd found the one true thing in a world made of lies and propaganda. He proposed in December, kneeling in the ruins of a garden behind the clinic, holding a ring he'd traded 2 months of cigarette rations for. Harumi said yes. Then she said they needed to talk. And that's when everything became complicated. She told him in pieces, careful pieces. She'd worked as a translator during the war, not for the military directly, but for a civilian logistics company that coordinated labor assignments. She'd processed paperwork, filed documents, translated orders. She'd never hurt anyone, she insisted, never carried a weapon, never made policy. But her name was in records, official records, records that the occupation authorities were now reviewing, looking for war criminals, collaborators, anyone who'd played a role in Japan's war machine. If they found her name, if they connected her work to certain facilities, certain labor camps, she could be arrested, deported. Worse, she'd changed her name after the war. Fujiwara wasn't her real surname. She'd taken it from a dead cousin, someone whose papers were intact, whose history was clean. Everett should have walked away. That's what the regulations said. That's what any smart soldier would have done. But he looked at Harumi, at the fear in her eyes and the desperate hope, and he made a choice. He would protect her, whatever it took. He had a contact, Captain Leland Pritchard, a man who owed him favors and understood that war made everyone complicit in something. Pritchard could smooth paperwork, make certain documents disappear, ensure that background checks came back clean. It would require careful coordination, a few strategic omissions, nothing overtly illegal, just selective blindness. The kind of blindness that happened all the time in occupied Japan, where the line between justice and revenge was painted in American blood and Japanese ash. The process took 3 months. 3 months of interviews, medical examinations, background investigations. Dr. Cornelius Whitmore conducted Harumi's security screening personally. Cold eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Questions delivered like scalpel cuts. Where did you work during the war? Who were your supervisors? What documents did you handle? Harumi answered with the story they'd prepared. Civilian translator for a textile company. Administrative work. Nothing sensitive. Nothing political. Everett sat outside the interview room, sweating through his uniform, praying that Pritchard's alterations would hold. They did. Barely. Whitmore seemed suspicious, but he had no evidence. No proof. Just instinct. And instinct wasn't enough to stop a determined sergeant from marrying the woman he loved. They married in March 1946. Small ceremony, a handful of witnesses. Harumi wore a dress that Doris had sent from Ohio, altered to fit her smaller frame. Everett wore his dress uniform, medals he didn't feel he'd earned pinned to his chest. Captain Pritchard attended, gave a brief toast, and never mentioned the files he'd buried. The marriage certificate listed Harumi Fujiwara, born in Tokyo, no living relatives, cleared for immigration to the United States. Every word carefully true. Every word carefully incomplete. They sailed for San Francisco in April. Harumi stood at the ship's railing, watching Japan disappear into the mist, and Everett wondered if she was saying goodbye or escaping. Maybe both. Maybe there was no difference. Ohio was harder than either of them expected. The town where Everett had grown up, where his father still ran the hardware store, where everyone knew everyone and strangers were examined like suspicious merchandise. Harumi was the first Japanese person most of them had ever seen. The war had ended less than a year ago. Sons and husbands were still coming home, some whole, some broken. And here was Everett Caldwell, returning with a Japanese wife. The looks they got, the whispers, the customers who suddenly didn't need hardware anymore. His father tried to be welcoming, tried and failed. Too much grief, too much anger. A cousin had died at Pearl Harbor. How was he supposed to smile at a Japanese woman across the dinner table? Doris was different. Doris Hartwell, Everett's older sister, sharp-tongued and surprisingly kind. She'd lost her husband in France, understood something about grief and survival that the others didn't. She took Harumi under her protection, taught her to navigate the unspoken rules of small-town Ohio, ran interference with the worst of the gossips. Harumi learned to make American food, speak with a softer accent, laugh at jokes she didn't find funny. She learned to make herself smaller, less foreign, less threatening. She became Harumi Caldwell, war bride, immigrant, perpetual outsider trying desperately to belong, and she never ever spoke about what she'd really done during the war. Years passed, the kind of years that blur together. Everett took over his father's hardware store. Harumi worked as a seamstress, then as a bookkeeper for a local insurance company. They had a son in 1952, Warren, American-born, American-raised. A bridge between two worlds that never quite connected. Warren grew up knowing his mother was different, knowing other kids whispered about her but never really understanding why. Harumi didn't talk about Japan, didn't teach him Japanese, didn't keep anything from her old life except a small wooden box she kept locked in the bedroom closet. Everett never asked what was in it. Some doors, once closed, should stay that way. The 1960s brought change, civil rights, Vietnam, a younger generation questioning everything their parents had built. Warren went to college, studied history, came home with questions about the war, about internment camps, about what America had done and what Japan had done and where justice fit into any of it. Harumi listened to her son's passionate arguments and said nothing. Everett watched her retreat further into silence, into the careful persona she'd constructed, and wondered if they'd made the right choice, if protection and love were the same thing, if the truth they'd buried was eating them alive from the inside. The 1970s were quieter. Warren graduated, got married, moved to Chicago. Everett retired. He and Harumi settled into the rhythm of elderly couples everywhere. Gardening, television, visits from grandchildren who saw Harumi as simply grandma, exotic only in the way all grandparents are exotic, belonging to a time before the world made sense. The past seemed safely distant. The war was history. The people who remembered were dying. The records were sealed. Everett let himself believe they'd succeeded, that the secret would die with them, that Harumi would live out her days as exactly who she'd pretended to be. Then the letter arrived. September 1985. Thin envelope. Japanese stamps. Return address in Hiroshima. Addressed to Harumi Caldwell, formerly Harumi Nakajima. That name. Nakajima. Everett felt his blood turn cold. He brought the letter inside, hands shaking. Harumi was in the kitchen. He heard her humming, an old Japanese melody she sometimes sang when she thought no one was listening. He stood in the doorway, holding the envelope like a bomb. She turned, saw his face, saw the letter. The color drained from her cheeks. The humming stopped. The letter was from Chio Okamoto, childhood friend, someone Harumi had known before the war, before everything changed. Chio had survived Hiroshima, barely. She'd spent 40 years searching for friends and family scattered by the war. She'd finally found a record, a marriage certificate, an immigration document. Harumi Nakajima, married to an American sergeant, relocated to the United States. She'd written to reconnect, to remember, to share memories of people and places long gone. The letter was innocent, affectionate, nostalgic, and it used Harumi's real name, the name that appeared in wartime records, the name connected to a labor coordination office in Yokohama that had processed assignments for factories, for construction projects, for facilities where prisoners of war and forced laborers worked until they died. Harumi read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table and looked at Everett with eyes that held 40 years of careful silence. She told him everything, the whole truth, not the edited version she'd given him in 1945, but the complete, unvarnished reality. Her real name was Harumi Nakajima. She'd worked for the Yokohama Labor Coordination Bureau from 1942 to 1945. She'd translated documents, processed assignments, filed reports. She'd known where the laborers were going, had known, in the abstract way you know things during war, that conditions were brutal, that people were dying. She'd never visited the sites, never gave orders, never pulled a trigger, but she'd been part of the machine, a small cog but a cog nonetheless, and she'd lived with that knowledge every single day for 40 years. She'd taken her cousin's name after the surrender. Fumiko Fujiwara had died in the Tokyo firebombing. No one left to contradict the identity. Clean papers, no wartime employment record. She'd become Fumiko, then simplified to Harumi when she married Everett, keeping the first name she'd always used. The deception had worked because Captain Pritchard had made it work, because Dr. Whitmore hadn't dug deep enough, because the occupation authorities had been overwhelmed with millions of cases and couldn't investigate everyone, because Everett had loved her enough to help her disappear. And now, 40 years later, a letter from Hiroshima had brought Harumi Nakajima back from the dead. Everett sat across from his wife and felt the weight of decades pressing down. What should he feel? Betrayed? He'd known she was hiding something. He'd chosen to help her hide it. Angry? At who? At Harumi for surviving the only way she could? At himself for being complicit? At the war for making monsters of ordinary people? He looked at this woman he'd loved for 40 years. This woman who'd made him dinner and raised his son and held his hand through his father's funeral. This woman who was also Harumi Nakajima, who'd processed paperwork that sent people to die. Were they the same person? Could they be? Warren needed to know. That much was clear. They called him that evening, asked him to come home. Something important. Warren arrived 2 days later, concerned, expecting news about health or finances. Instead, his parents sat him down and told him that everything he knew about his mother's past was a lie. Not a small lie, not an omission, a fundamental reconstruction of identity. Warren listened in stunned silence as Harumi explained who she'd really been, what she'd really done, why she'd hidden it. Everett watched his son's face cycle through shock, confusion, anger, something that might have been understanding or might have been horror. Warren was a historian. He understood context, understood that war created impossible choices, understood that judging the past by the present was complicated and messy and necessary. But this was his mother, the woman who'd packed his school lunches and taught him to be kind and told him stories about Japanese folklore. How was he supposed to reconcile that with a woman who'd been part of Japan's wartime labor system? He asked questions. Hard questions. Did you know what was happening to the prisoners? Yes. Could you have refused? Maybe. Probably not. Did you try? No. Why not? Because I wanted to survive. Because everyone was part of it. Because saying no meant becoming one of the people being processed instead of one of the people processing. The conversation lasted hours. Painful, necessary hours. Warren didn't storm out, didn't condemn, but he didn't absolve either. He sat with the complexity of it, with the reality that people he loved were capable of things he found morally reprehensible, that his existence was built on a lie his father had helped construct, that the past wasn't dead, wasn't even past. It was right here in this living room in Ohio, demanding to be acknowledged. Before he left, he asked what they were going to do about the letter. Harumi said nothing. There was nothing to do. Chio didn't know about the name change, didn't know about the deception. She just wanted to reconnect with an old friend. They would write back, carefully, maintaining the fiction, because what else could they do? But Warren had a different idea. He'd been researching war crimes trials, reconciliation projects, truth and justice commissions. There were organizations now in the 1980s working to document what had happened during the war, to preserve testimonies, to create historical records before everyone who remembered was gone. He suggested gently that Harumi consider giving her testimony, not as a confession, not as a legal proceeding, just as history, just as truth. Harumi refused immediately. Too dangerous, too painful, too late. What good would it do now? Warren pressed. What good does silence do? The argument was circular, exhausting. It ended without resolution, just raw feelings and the understanding that some wounds don't heal, they just scar over. Everett and Harumi wrote back to Chio, a warm letter full of carefully vague reminiscences. Harumi asked about mutual friends, about Hiroshima's recovery, about Chio's life. She didn't mention the name change, didn't explain about America, just reconnected as if 40 years and an ocean and a false identity were minor details. Chio wrote back. They began a correspondence. Letters every few months, fragments of the past, carefully curated, safely distant. Everett watched Harumi write these letters and wondered what it cost her. To be Harumi Nakajima again, even just on paper. To remember the person she'd been before she became the person she'd pretended to be. The mid-1980s brought more changes. Reagan was president. The Cold War was thawing. There was talk of reparations for Japanese Americans who'd been interned. Formal apologies, acknowledgement of historical wrongs. Warren sent his parents newspaper clippings. Look, he seemed to be saying. Look how countries can face their past. Look how truth can coexist with reconciliation. Harumi read the articles and said nothing. Everett knew what she was thinking. Those were victims being acknowledged. She wasn't a victim. She was something more complicated, something without a clear category. Neither perpetrator nor bystander, but somewhere in the uncomfortable middle where most people actually lived during war. In 1987, Everett had a heart attack. Mild, but enough to remind them both that time was finite. He recovered, but something shifted. A sense of urgency, of unfinished business. He started talking to Harumi about what would happen after he was gone. Practical things, finances, the house, but also the secret. What would she do when he wasn't there to help maintain the fiction? Harumi admitted she didn't know. Part of her wanted to die as Harumi Caldwell, taking Harumi Nakajima to the grave. Part of her wondered if Warren was right. If testimony, even now, even this late, might matter. Not for forgiveness. She didn't expect forgiveness. But for record. For the stubborn insistence that truth, however uncomfortable, was better than carefully maintained lies. They talked to Warren again. Long phone calls. Difficult conversations. Warren had found an oral history project at a university. Researchers documenting the Pacific War from multiple perspectives. American veterans, Japanese civilians, Korean forced laborers. They wanted complexity, wanted to move beyond simple narratives of good and evil. Harumi could contribute, anonymously if she wanted, just her story, her perspective, what it was like to be a young woman in wartime Japan, making choices that seemed reasonable then and damning now. Warren didn't push, just offered the information, left the decision to her. It took Harumi 6 months to decide. 6 months of sleepless nights and conversations with Everett and letters to Chio that danced around the real questions. Finally, in early 1988, she agreed. She would give her testimony, not anonymously. If she was going to do this, she would do it as Harumi Nakajima. She would use her real name, acknowledge what she'd done, let historians and descendants and anyone who cared to listen judge for themselves. Everett held her hand when she made the call, felt her trembling, felt his own fear. This could destroy everything, could bring legal consequences, could shatter the life they'd built. But it could also, maybe, finally let them stop running. The interview took place over 3 days. A researcher from the university, young woman with a tape recorder and endless patience. She asked questions. Harumi answered. Slowly at first, then with increasing detail. She described pre-war Japan, her education, her family, the gradual slide into militarism, the way ordinary life became wartime life became survival. She described her work at the Labor Coordination Bureau, the documents she translated, the assignments she processed, the deliberate ignorance she maintained about where people were going and what was happening to them. She described the surrender, the occupation, meeting Everett, the choice to take her cousin's identity, the 40 years of silence. The researcher asked the hard question, "Do you feel guilty?" Harumi thought for a long time. Yes, and no. Yes, because I knew people were suffering and I did nothing. No, because I was 20 years old and terrified and doing what I was told in a system that would have crushed me if I'd refused. Both things are true. I was complicit. I was also powerless. Those aren't contradictions. That's just what war is. Most people aren't heroes or monsters. They're just people, trying to survive, making choices they'll spend the rest of their lives questioning. I don't ask for forgiveness. I don't think I deserve it. But I want people to know it wasn't simple. It was never simple. The testimony was archived, added to a growing collection of voices from the war. Harumi's story became part of the historical record. Harumi Nakajima, labor coordinator, Yokohama, 1942 to 1945. Later, Harumi Caldwell, immigrant, Ohio. The researchers assured her the testimony was for educational purposes. No legal action would result. The statute of limitations had long passed, and her role had been too minor for war crimes prosecution anyway. She was safe, legally safe. Whether she was morally safe, whether any of them were, remained an open question. Warren came to visit after the testimony was complete. He sat with his mother in the garden Everett had planted years ago, asked how she felt. Harumi said she felt lighter and heavier. Lighter because the secret was finally spoken. Heavier because speaking it made it real in a way silence never had. Warren told her he was proud of her, not for what she'd done during the war, but for having the courage finally to tell the truth about it. Harumi cried. Everett, watching from the kitchen window, cried too. Not from sadness, from relief. From the exhausting, overwhelming relief of finally, after 43 years, being able to stop hiding. Chio learned the truth in a letter Harumi sent in late 1988. A long letter, explaining everything. The name change, the deception, the testimony, the 40 years of pretending to be someone else. Harumi didn't know what response to expect. Anger, betrayal, understanding. Chio's reply came 6 weeks later. She wrote that she'd suspected something, that the Harumi she remembered had a different energy, a different weight to her silence. She wrote that she understood, that survival took many forms, that she didn't judge, that their friendship, whatever name it traveled under, was real. Harumi read that letter a dozen times, kept it in the wooden box with the few items she'd brought from Japan. Proof that some connections survive even truth. The 1990s arrived. Everett and Harumi grew old together, really old. The kind of old where every day is a gift and a surprise. They watched the Cold War end, watched the world change in ways they'd never imagined. Warren's children, their grandchildren, grew up in a world where Japan and America were allies, where the war was ancient history, where Grandma's accent was just part of who she was, not a reminder of enemy status. Harumi volunteered at a local community center, teaching origami to children. Small act, simple act, but it felt like reclaiming something, being Japanese, being herself, not hiding. In 1995, 50 years after the war ended, there were commemorations, remembrances. Everett and Harumi watched the coverage on television, veterans returning to Pacific battlefields, survivors sharing stories, official apologies and unofficial reconciliations. Warren called, asked if they wanted to participate in any events. Harumi said no. She'd given her testimony. That was enough. She didn't need to be public, didn't need to be a symbol. She just needed to live out her remaining years as honestly as possible. Everett agreed. They'd done what they could. The rest was for historians and descendants to work through. Everett died in 1998. Heart failure. Peaceful. Harumi held his hand, told him she loved him, told him thank you for protecting her, for loving her, for helping her survive and eventually finally tell the truth. Everett squeezed her hand, smiled, said he'd do it all again, every choice, every risk, because she was worth it. Those were his last words. She was worth it. Harumi sat with his body for an hour after he passed, holding his hand, remembering Yokohama, remembering the young sergeant who'd offered to carry a crate and ended up carrying her whole life. Warren helped arrange the funeral. Small service. Harumi insisted on including both American and Japanese elements, Christian prayers and Buddhist incense, English and Japanese. Everett would have appreciated the hybrid nature of it, the way it refused to choose one identity over another. He'd lived in that in-between space too. American soldier, husband to a Japanese woman, keeper of secrets, teller of truth. All of it, all at once. Doris attended, ancient now, still sharp-tongued. She hugged Harumi, whispered that Everett had been lucky to find her, that they'd both been lucky. Harumi nodded, couldn't speak, just held on to this woman who'd been kind when kindness was rare. Harumi lived another 7 years. Quiet years. She moved into a smaller apartment, saw Warren and her grandchildren regularly, corresponded with Chio until Chio passed in 2002, continued her origami classes, wrote occasional letters to the Oral History Project, adding details she'd forgotten, clarifying points, making sure the record was as complete as possible. She never expressed regret about the testimony, never wished she'd maintained the silence, but she also never claimed it had resolved anything. The past was still the past. The guilt was still the guilt. Truth didn't erase that, it just made it visible. She died in 2005, 82 years old. Stroke. Quick. Warren was with her. She was lucid until the end. She told him to make sure her testimony stayed in the archive, that it wasn't removed or edited, that future generations could access it, could know that Harumi Nakajima existed, that she'd done what she'd done, that she'd spent 40 years hiding and the rest of her life trying to make that hiding mean something. Warren promised, kept that promise. The testimony is still there, still accessible, still complicated, still true. The funeral was small. Warren included elements from both his parents' services, hybrid, in between. He gave a eulogy that didn't shy away from complexity, talked about his mother's courage and her complicity, her love and her lies, her survival and her testimony. He said that she'd taught him that people contain multitudes, that history isn't simple, that love sometimes means protecting people from truth, and sometimes means helping them finally tell it. He said he was proud to be her son, all of her son, the son of Harumi Nakajima and Harumi Caldwell and every version of herself she'd been forced to become. After the service, Warren went through his mother's things, found the wooden box. Inside were letters from Everett, letters from Chio, a few photographs from Japan, her real birth certificate, Harumi Nakajima, born 1923, Tokyo, and a small notebook, pages filled with Japanese characters. Warren couldn't read most of it. He had it translated. It was a journal. Started in 1945, continued sporadically until just before she died. Entries about guilt, about memory, about the cost of silence and the cost of truth, about loving Everett, about raising Warren, about wondering if she'd made the right choices, about knowing she'd made the only choices available, about hoping that someday someone would understand that those two things weren't contradictory. Warren donated the journal to the Oral History Project, along with the letters, the photographs, everything that documented his mother's life, both lives, all her lives. He wrote an introduction explaining the context, the name change, the 40-year secret, the letter from Hiroshima that started the unraveling, the testimony, the reconciliation such as it was. He ended with a question. What do we owe the past? Truth? Forgiveness? Judgment? Understanding? All of it? None of it? He didn't have an answer. Just the question, and his mother's story, and the hope that complexity could coexist with accountability, that people could be both complicit and human, that history could hold space for all of it. The archive is open to researchers, students, descendants of the war, anyone interested in understanding how ordinary people navigate extraordinary circumstances. Harumi's testimony gets cited occasionally, in dissertations, in documentaries, in discussions about memory and responsibility. She's never a main character, just one voice among thousands, one story among millions. But she's there. Harumi Nakajima, labor coordinator, war bride, immigrant, mother, grandmother, woman who hid and woman who spoke. Both, always both. The photograph from Yokohama Harbor, the one Everett kept face down for 40 years, is in the archive too. You can see it if you visit. Harumi in a borrowed dress, Everett's hand on her shoulder, both of them young, both of them scared, both of them hoping that love might be enough to outrun the past. It wasn't, but it was enough to eventually face it, and maybe that's all any of us can hope for. Not escape, just the courage, eventually, to stop running. So if you found this story meaningful, subscribe to dive deeper into untold histories like this. Hit like if you appreciate the complexity of human stories, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts on how we should remember the past. History isn't simple, and neither are we.